Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, episode 66 Lyon, Liberated City. They say success begets success, but sometimes that's just not true. Despite successfully overthrowing the Jacobin municipality, the citizens of Lyon suddenly hit a problem. A problem the size of Paris. With the purge of the Girondins occurring just days later, events in the capital compelled Lyon to act. Would the city stop at municipal revolution and accept a Jacobin-controlled convention, or would they join their fellow departments and declare resistance to oppression? Despite significant negotiations, delegations, and even concessions, the end result was a bloodbath, culminating in a 2-month siege, a horrific repression, and events that historian Michael Sydenham equates to mass murder. We have arrived at the terror in Lyon. We have arrived at one of the most controversial chapters of the French Revolution. But before we get into it, a huge thank you to those members of the Grey History community for keeping Grey History on the air. For bonus episodes, episode extras, ad-free listening, a members-only chat room, and a range of other exclusive perks, join the Grey History community today. You can cancel anytime, but for a small contribution when future episodes are released, you can do your part to ensure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow. Those members with early access can listen to episode 67 right now. Titled Lyon, the Blame Game, this bonus episode, available exclusively to community members, will be getting into the controversies surrounding one of the bloodiest events of the Reign of Terror. So, for bonus content like this, and a whole host of other benefits, help produce history that isn't black and white, and follow the link in the show notes or on the website. Join the Grey History community today. It's with great pleasure that I get to introduce the newest members of the community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Matt, Mike, Simon, Chris, Helen, Matthew L., Torrick, and Gib. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, James, Daniel, Tabitha, David, and Michael. I hope you all enjoyed your early access to this episode weeks ahead of the main show. Of course, revolutions need their champions. It's as simple as that. So a big thank you to the champions of the people, Cindy, George, Mark, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Kevin, Carl, Jeff, Regis, and Hannah. Finally, a tremendous thank you to the extraordinarily generous heroes of the revolution, Brian, Christy, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, and Howard. Thank you again to everyone for your support of the show, and thank you to those people sending in one-time donations, leaving written reviews, and sharing the show with friends, family, or just strangers on the internet. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into the terror in Lyon. In the French Revolution, there are multiple contenders for the individuals, factions, and communities which have the worst possible timing. Take, for example, the disastrous French expedition to Ireland in 1796. An attempt to pry Ireland from British hands, the fleet was absolutely decimated by once-in-a-lifetime storms. Another example comes from 1791, when the royal family failed to escape Paris during the flight to Varennes. On multiple occasions, the monarchs ran into precisely the wrong people at precisely the wrong time. The examples are numerous, but a noteworthy contender for worst timing of the revolution has got to be the municipal revolution of Lyon in May 1793. Had it occurred just a few weeks prior, it's possible that the history of Lyon, and indeed the history of the Terror, would be entirely different. But it didn't. The anti-Jacobin coalition of Lyon overthrew their opponents at the most inopportune moment. For just 4 days later, the Jacobins of Paris would overthrow the Girondins of the Convention and see to their south not a popular revolution defending one's rights and liberties, but rather an egregious and horrific act of counter-revolution. By early June 1793, both Paris and the authorities of Lyon had decisions to make. The two camps needed an approach to the other, and unfortunately for the pair, the information they were working with was at best contradictory and at worst completely wrong. From the perspective of the now Jacobin-controlled convention, there were competing opinions as to whether the city of Lyon required an olive branch or a prompt visit from the Revolutionary Army. In terms of the latter, some staunch Jacobins saw in Lyon's insurrection nothing short of counter-revolution. This is how the municipal revolution had been publicly portrayed by some Jacobin deputies just hours before the Girondins were purged. As such, the solution to the unrest in Lyon was simple: military force. There could be no negotiation with the nobles, priests, and intriguers who jeopardized the Republic's very existence. Bolstering those who favored a military expedition was in fact a representative on mission stationed in the south. The deputy Dubois-Croiset, whose movements of troops had helped to trigger Lyon's revolution, was adamant that a crackdown was the best way forward. An ally of the Jacobin municipality which had been overthrown, Dubois-Croiset perceived the events of late May as nothing short of a counter-revolutionary act. Worse still, he feared that Lyon could become a new Vendée, a heavily armed royalist stronghold, and one that would cripple the current war effort. Indeed, Lyon's strategic importance was immense. It was one of the principal supply centres for multiple armies, and second only to Paris in terms of its importance for crossroads and communications. As such, Dubois-Croiset wasted no time in doing what helped to trigger this mess in the first place. The deputy ordered the Army of the Alps to once more march on Lyon. But back in Paris, the appetite for military confrontation with the nation's second city was far more limited. The convention and its Committee of Public Safety were receiving a range of mixed reports. Yes, Dubois-Croiset wanted action, but others took the opposite view. Letters from representatives on mission within Lyon suggested that there was no reason to fear counter-revolution. Likewise, deputies stationed in nearby departments also wrote to their colleagues in Paris, cautioning against a military response. In fact, some even demanded that Dubois-Croiset and the Army of the Alps be constrained. Agents of the Interior Minister also reported news that obscured the situation. Portraying the events of late May in a positive light, one agent of the Interior Minister with Rollon'an sympathies assured his bosses that they need not be anxious. But, Citizen Minister, reassure well the convention that it has nothing to fear. The citizens of Lyon have covered themselves with glory. They have shown the greatest courage in the battles that took place in the different neighbourhoods of the city, and the greatest generosity towards their enemies, who have behaved like scoundrels. For if they had carried the day, Lyon would have been lost. More than 50,000 men would have had their throats slit. With such contradictory reports, the convention decided to hit the pause button on any military crackdown. This was no doubt influenced by the fact that the rest of the nation was seemingly on the verge of insurrection in response to the purge of the Girondins. Picking a fight with Lyon, particularly one that was perhaps unnecessary, seemed to many to be an undesirable path. The deputy Dubois-Croisset and the army of the Alps were promptly told to sit on their hands. Instead, in response to Lyon's insurrection, the Committee of Public Safety sent one of their own, the prominent independent deputy Robert Lyon. We saw Lyon play a prominent role in episode 63, where we covered the revolt of the North. It had been Lyon who played a crucial part in the convention's decree to offer leniency to those departments which admitted that they had been mistaken in their prior protests regarding the Girondin proscriptions. It was also Lyon who led the so-called Army of Pacification against the Norman and Breton departments in July 1793. At this point in time, early June, neither of these events had yet occurred, but Lyon's level-headed and conciliatory personality remained. Arriving in Lyon on the 8th of June, the reception was frosty, but the deputy formed the view that reconciliation was possible. Insisting that the city's citizens were good Republicans, Lyon implored his colleagues to swiftly publish a constitution and provide formal justifications for the purge of the Girondins. With both communication and goodwill, a peaceful resolution was obtainable. But it takes two to tango, and the citizens of Lyon also had to determine their own approach. Conscious that the violent overthrow of their Jacobin municipality could be misconstrued as counter-revolution, the city sent a delegation to the convention explaining their actions. However, like the delegation sent by the Norman department of Calvados, this delegation arrived in a capital unwilling to hear anything they had to say. Leading Girondins were fleeing Paris, and the triumphant Jacobins were disinterested in those potentially promoting lies and deception. Back in Lyon, news of the Girondins' downfall was greeted with alarm, bolstering anti-Jacobin sentiments within the city. It was thus in this less than welcoming environment that the deputy Lyon arrived. Seen as a potential puppet of the tyrants which had illegally seized the convention, many in Lyon's authorities harboured deep reservations about the newcomer. Not helping the matter was the fact that the convention's previous representatives on mission had been so far supportive of their local Jacobin allies, and Lyon even arrived in the city in the same coach as a prominent Jacobin who had been in Paris lobbying in favour of Lyon's loathed revolutionary tribunal. Yet, for all their suspicions, the new authorities were at an impasse as to what to do with Lyon. Some sections argued that the convention was no longer whole nor free, and thus Lyon's mission to Lyon couldn't be recognised as legitimate. Other sections went further, suggesting that the member of the Committee of Public Safety be arrested, held as a hostage until the safety of the proscribed Girondins had been guaranteed. With the sections in bitter disagreement, indecision reigned supreme, especially as sectional autonomy had been an ideological foundation for Lyon's municipal revolution. Nonetheless, with Lyon remaining out of jail, the inaction of Lyon's various authorities suggested that a peaceful solution was possible. Some Norman departments had already declared themselves in insurrection, and other regions looked likely to follow. The fact that Lyon had not formally rebelled was a significant factor in favour of peace. But while Lyon had not initially risen in insurgency against the purge of the Girondins, that didn't mean that the city couldn't join the insurrectionary bandwagon. Throughout the month of June, as the local authorities determined a path forward, developments across the country bolstered calls for rebellion. Historian Bill Edmonds asserts that the purge of 2 June gave a new ideological coherence to Lyon's anti-Jacobin authorities, and historian Paul Hansen notes the momentum created by the actions of other administrations. To explore that last point, throughout the first weeks of June, reports flew in as dozens of departments formally protested the mutilation of the national government. As we saw in the Norman department of Calvados, these protesting departments generally demanded the reinstatement of the prescribed deputies and the curtailment of anarchy and extremism in the capital. Critically, some departments had chosen weapons, not words, as they sought to reverse the Girondins' ejection. According to the latest reports, the ancient provinces of Normandy and Brittany had moved beyond mere protest and had united in a grand northern rebellion. Meanwhile, it seemed that Bordeaux, Marseille, and other large urban centres were either moving towards or had already formally declared insurrection. Some reports even claimed that there were too many volunteers for the newly created departmental forces, and that the likely over-enrollment was a clear sign of the rebellion's popular support and legitimacy in the face of the capital's anarchists who had seized the people's representatives. But unfortunately for the authorities of Lyon, these accounts were a little too good to be true. While they contained no shortage of grand promises and bold proclamations, what was missing was cold, hard facts and a sobering dose of reality. Lost within the exaggerated rhetoric was the fundamental struggles of the other emerging federalist strongholds. Yes, the northern departments were amassing an army to liberate Paris, but volunteers for that force were almost non-existent. Remember, despite proclaiming their intention to raise an army of 60,000 Northmen, the rebels eventually assembled a force of just a few thousand. Likewise, while dozens of departments protested the purging of the Girondins, few were actually translating those words into actions. Within many authorities, and within the communities they represented, deep divisions often paralysed any meaningful response. Yet, the authorities of Lyon didn't know this, and so they took at face value the encouraging news emerging across the nation. Those in favour used these developments to push their case for formal insurrection. 2 days after the deputy Linder departed Lyon, the local department announced elections for a new departmental assembly. Eventually taking the name of the Popular Republican and Public Safety Commission of Rhône-et-Loire, this mouthful was a key step towards possible insurrection. Officially, the body was created in order for citizens to exercise their sovereignty, to judge the violation of their rights, to restore them, and to save the homeland. Unofficially, this new body could be a key tool for those who wished to take the fight to Paris. After all, the elections on the 24th of June would create a body with a popular and democratic mandate, one that could claim considerable legitimacy should it formally rebel. However, rebellion against the existing convention wasn't the only game in town. It is clear that this body was also meant to deliberate on whether an alternative, a supplemental convention, should be established, an idea that already had the support of many nearby departments. Whether this was a replacement for the National Convention, or merely a provisional body until the original one had been restored and secured, Well, that's a matter of historical debate. But for those who see the Federalist rebels as pursuing a Federalist agenda, the proposed empowerment of an alternative government was a cardinal sin. Whatever the intended purpose of this alternative convention, serious consideration was given to forming a new national government free from the corrupting influence of Paris. Also noteworthy is that historians of different ideological persuasions debate just how popular this new popular commission was. Ironically, scholars use the same electoral participation statistics to try to make the case, both for and against the popularity of the new institution. As historians bitterly debate just how popular the Federalist revolts were in general, the participation in elections such as these offer a key quantitative measurement, alongside enrolment in departmental forces. For Lyon, the results are a bit ambiguous. It is clear that considerable support existed for the new popular commission in some of the wealthier sections, but it was lacking in the poorest sections, as well as rural regions of the department. Whatever the case may be, some sections wasted no time, and the staunchest anti-Jacobin sections refused to even wait for the elections to demand immediate action. The day after the department announced the convening of the primary assemblies to elect the Popular Commission, one section declared itself to be in a state of resistance to oppression. Encouraged by reports from across France, it called for an armed force to join other rebellious cities and march against Paris. Lyon's provisional municipal council, which had been installed after the overthrow of the local Jacobin municipality, endorsed this proposal, and initial recruitment efforts commenced after the 19th of June. Thus, by the time the department-wide Popular Commission actually met, Lyon was well and truly on its way towards formal rebellion, even if it hadn't been declared. The Popular Commission began to meet in early July, roughly a month after Lyon's municipal revolution and the purging of the Girondins, which had followed shortly thereafter. Although a departmental body, the commission was actually dominated by delegates from Lyon, meaning the city and its anti-Jacobin tendencies had an outsized influence on the actions taken. The delegates were far from unanimous in how to approach the situation. Some demanded insurrection and pointed to the example and apparent success of other departments as they made their case. Others were skeptical. They were unsure as to what any rebellion would actually achieve, particularly delegates from the rural areas of the department. As the delegates debated amongst themselves, the pendulum swung in favour of revolt thanks to the intervention of a fugitive Girondin deputy. Just as the arrival of Girondins had supercharged Normandy's rebellion, so too did the arrival of a representative named Jean-Baptiste Birotteau. Himself one of the proscribed deputies, multiple historians note the importance of Birotteau's speech. To say that it was dramatic would be an understatement. Birotteau claimed that what was left of the Rump Convention was nothing more than nobles, priests, and the perpetrators of the September massacres. These tyrants sought to reinstall the monarchy and relied on brigands and sans-culottes to terrorize the capital's inhabitants. Paris, he claimed, had been lost to the anarchists. Deputies were in fear of their lives. Citizens longed for liberation. The Jacobins had inflicted the most egregious assault against the rights and liberties of the French, and only the departments could rectify this most terrible wrong. Encouraging the citizens of Lyon to march on Paris, Birotteau made it clear that the majority of Parisians were eagerly awaiting salvation from their brothers in the provinces. Now, we of course can see that these exaggerated claims are a long way from the truth, but Birotteau's confirmation of the rumoured anarchy in the capital decisively moved the popular commission in favour of insurrection. The day prior, the delegates had still been bitterly debating as to whether or not to recognise the decrees of the National Convention. Just 24 hours later, the body had agreed with Birotteau. The convention was dead. Thus, from the 4th of July, Lyon was in a state of insurrection. Over the days and weeks that followed, the Popular Commission undertook a range of decisive measures. Measures which greatly angered and alienated the remaining deputies of the National Convention. For a department in rebellion, some of the Popular Commission's actions were entirely to be expected. Like the other Federalist cities, the Convention's representatives on mission were arrested, and a departmental armed force was officially created. Furthermore, nearby military supplies were promptly seized, just as had occurred in the rebellious Norman departments. But controversially, the commander of the new departmental force was an unusual pick. Leading the new force was Précy, a former noble and rumoured royalist. Once an officer in Louis XVI's Constitutional Guard, Précy's personal sympathies were those of a constitutional monarchist, rather than a reactionary ultra-royalist. However, that distinction amounted to the splitting of hairs for Jacobin Republicans already convinced that Lyon's municipal revolution was nothing short of a counter-revolutionary plot. Indeed, the press had a field day chattering about Précy's royalist inclinations, and it's known that the new commander remained on good terms with some émigrés. Given this, Précy's appointment didn't just outrage the Parisian Jacobins, but in fact some of the proscribed Girondins, energising the Federalist rebels. The deputy Birotteau, who played such a critical role in encouraging Lyon to rebel, was dismayed by Précy's selection. Regardless of Précy's experience and willingness to do the job, the installation of a former aristocratic officer and one of the King's Guard hardly helped to discredit perceptions that Lyon was a royalist and reactionary stronghold. As such, another key initiative undertaken by the Popular Commission related to propaganda. Extensive efforts were made to make it clear that Jacobin accusations of counter-revolution were lies and deception, and that it was instead the anarchists of Paris that had pushed France to the brink of civil war. In attempting to justify their actions through envoys, letters, and declarations, Lyon was again following a similar playbook to the other Federalist centres, although this time great efforts were taken to dispel rumours of royalism. However, as historian Takashi Koi notes, the Popular Commission had its work cut out for it. In addition to Précy's command and Lyon's existing royalist reputation, the Popular Commission's delegation consisted of a considerable number of priests and former nobles, almost 20%. Needless to say, the Jacobins of Paris had no shortage of ways to argue their case that Lyon had succumbed to counter-revolution. But in addition to replicating the actions of other insurrectionary departments, Lyon decided to, Lyon. Always one to carve a unique path, Lyon proceeded to systematically pursue leading Jacobin officials. Smart enough to leave the convention's representatives on mission untouched, the first person in the crosshairs of revolutionary justice was none other than Joseph Chalais. The most prominent face of Lyon's Jacobins, Chalais personally embodied the Jacobin municipality that Lyon's current leaders had overthrown just weeks before. Detained in late May during the municipal revolution, by July he was brought to trial. Accused of planning an attack on the sovereignty and liberty of the people, the prominent Jacobin had allegedly provoked murder and pillage both through his writings and discourse. Held responsible for the bloodshed on the 29th of May, that being the day of Lyon's municipal revolution, Charlet was executed on the 16th of July. Unfortunately for Charlet, it took 3 attempts for the guillotine's blade to finally complete the deed. Ouch is an understatement. Interestingly, another prominent officer in the Jacobin municipality, the commander of the National Guard, was also tried the same day. However, the commander was acquitted, and the trial of other Jacobin office holders was relatively constrained. This prompts some historians to note the reluctance of Lyon's officials in executing local Jacobins en masse, and some even suggest that Charlet's trial was only brought about due to public pressure and fears of unrest if it didn't proceed. I'm not quite sure I buy that reasoning, but whatever the motivation, the end outcome was unrestrained outrage from the Jacobins in Paris. The convention had already decreed that the authorities of Lyon would be held responsible for those it had detained during the municipal revolution. The national body also formally suspended all legal proceedings against the local Jacobins. Thus, when news hit Paris that Lyon had executed one of their most patriotic allies, Jacobin deputies were displeased, to say the least. Now, technically, Lyon's Popular Commission refused to recognize these proclamations, arguing that the convention was no longer whole nor free. As a result, it had continued with its trial of Charlet. Be that as it may, that didn't lighten the anger of the Parisian Jacobins when they found out that Charlet had lost his head. Some had personally known Charlet from his time in the capital throughout 1792. Others were simply outraged by this injustice, with their anger no doubt amplified by the fact that the deputy Marat, another Jacobin martyr, had been assassinated just 3 days before, on the 13th of July. Consequently, historian Paul Hansen claims that the execution of Charlet permanently alienated the Paris Jacobins. Historian Timothy Tackett agrees, noting that the Mountain perceived that a local terror was being conducted against their allies in Lyon. In short, the city of Silk had gone too far. In conjunction with raising an armed force, supporting an alternative convention, and arresting representatives on mission, in the first weeks of July, Lyon's rebels had crossed the proverbial Rubicon. But, as historian Alan Forrest remarks, the most notable aspect of Lyon's revolt was its horribly inept timing. The Popular Commission formally created a departmental force on the 13th of July, and 3 days later, Charlet was executed on the 16th. Consequently, by the time that Lyon was escalating its insurrection in mid-July, the Federalist revolts were already starting to crumble. Take, for example, the Grand Rebellion of the North. Linde's Army of Pacification had fought with the Northern rebels on the 13th. In fact, using the word fought is being very generous. This briefest of firefights resulted in perhaps 0 deaths. But, as discussed in episode 63, the Northerners never recovered, and the rebellion in Normandy proceeded to collapse like a house of cards. So, just to be clear, as Lyon ratcheted up its insurrection, the northern insurrectionists were days away from capitulation. However, Lyon's timing was actually worse than it first appears. You may also recall that in response to protests from across the nation, the convention conducted a range of politically astute maneuvers. Two of particular note was the introduction of the new constitution on the 24th of June, and 2 days later, a decree stating that those that did not retract their prior protests would be declared traitors. The latter was essentially a giant hint that those who backed down immediately could expect more lenient treatment, although it didn't say that explicitly. The timing of these measures is critical. What this meant is that just as Lyon slurped every last drop of the insurrectionary punch bowl, its neighbouring departments, the ones that were theoretically going to join in a march against the capital, withdrew. Even departments that had been forthright in their initial protestations suddenly got cold feet. Take, for example, the department of Jura to Lyon's northeast, bordering modern-day Switzerland. Initially, Jura had supported the idea of creating an alternative convention and vocally protested the purging of the Girondins. But, as we've previously discussed, the new constitution offered an off-ramp for divided and uncertain communities, and undermined the narrative that the Jacobins of Paris were tyrants and anarchists. As such, on the 12th of July, 4 days before Challier's execution, two commissioners from Jura shocked Lyon's popular commission. Jura was preparing to convoke its primary assemblies. The department would vote on the new constitution. A mere 8 days later, on the 20th of July, envoys returned from Jura with even more alarming news. The department had voted yes. Accepting the Jacobins' constitution, the department's breach with the convention was at an end. Jura would not partake in the struggle with the mountain. Worse still, this same sequence of events occurred in other neighbouring departments. Commissioners from R and Do also arrived, informing the rebels that they too had voted for constitution and peace. Hoping to avoid civil war, they sought to mediate between the convention and Lyon's popular commission. These were the departments that were meant to march with Lyon to expel the tyrants of the capital. Now they had accepted the constitution and were encouraging Lyon to do the same. Just why these departments backed down is a matter of debate. These communities were undoubtedly divided, and foreign and civil war presented considerable risks. With the convention seemingly offering a viable path towards constitutional government, many were keen to take it. A delegate from Jura offered another explanation: recruitment, or more accurately, lack thereof. Like the other rebellious regions, Jura had struggled to mobilize sufficient volunteers to march on the convention. Concluding that they lacked any ability to withstand the mountain by force, local authorities had decided that the safest path to victory was the ballot box. As such, the authorities would embrace the constitution and seek change through democratic means. However, despite seeing hints of this changing of the tide before they had executed Charlier, the staunchest anti-Jacobins of Lyon demanded continued insurrection. Offers of mediation were ignored. Yet the Commission suddenly faced an unexpected problem: the new constitution. With nearby departments convoking their primary assemblies to vote on the document, pressure mounted on Lyon to do the same. Why should the citizens of the department of Rhône-et-Loire be denied their rights? Why should they not deliberate on the proposal? as Lyon's popular commission had refused to recognise any decrees of the convention after the 31st of May. This naturally included the Jacobin constitution produced in late June. However, the pressure to summon the primary assemblies soon became irresistible, especially for an insurrection which had its origins in proclaiming the primacy of sectional assemblies and their deliberations. Despite significant hostility from leading figures in the city, Lyon ultimately voted to accept the new constitution. To be clear, many conditions, alterations, and qualifications were proposed, something that will become important later. But the vote in favour of the constitution was overwhelming nonetheless. Just like other departments, the reasons for this acceptance are disputed and complicated. At first glance, it might seem odd that a city in revolt and governed by an anti-Jacobin coalition would deliver such a verdict. After all, it was a Jacobin-drafted constitution that had been approved. But it's important to remember that many modern historians refute the idea that this was some royalist counter-revolutionary insurgency, despite that portrayal in traditional Jacobin histories. Sure, some prominent royalists were involved, and yes, some sought to use Lyon's commotion for their own political ends. However, by and large, this was a Republican revolt, to use the term of historian Michael Sydenham. As such, it's entirely reasonable that a Republican constitution, however imperfect, would be accepted in a time of such great national crisis. A new constitution offered a chance to turn the page on the factional chaos of the past year. Furthermore, it provided an opening to avert civil war. And that last point is key. By the time Lyon was voting on the constitution, the citizens of the city already knew that a Republican army was on the march. Historian Bill Edmonds suggests that some in the Popular Commission hoped that an attack could be avoided if Lyon could demonstrate its Republican credentials. A vote in favour of the Constitution could be seen as a tangible step towards a negotiated outcome, one that would prove Lyon's municipal revolution was not counter-revolutionary, not royalist, and not a threat that required a military solution. An alternative motivation for the Constitution's acceptance is proposed by other historians, who see this as evidence that the revolt lacked popular support amongst ordinary people. They argue that the vote simply reflects a genuine desire for reconciliation and peace, and amounts to a rebuke of the city's elites who had erroneously led Lyon down the path of rebellion. Whatever the case may be, by late July, it seems clear that there was appetite in the city for a peaceful resolution, and this evidence is much more than the Constitution's acceptance. As the convention's forces marched on Lyon, some citizens and officials were actively seeking a deal with the convention. Negotiations were opened with nearby representatives on mission, along with the government in the capital. The peace camp within Lyon was clearly sizable, and members of the department and the provisional municipality were advocating loudly for some form of reconciliation. In fact, they advocated so loudly that they debatably pushed the more hostile Popular Commission into making a series of concessions. Consequently, measures were taken by a variety of institutions, including the department, the provisional municipality, and the Popular Commission, to elicit goodwill with the convention. For example, in addition to accepting the new constitution, the detained representatives on mission were released, as were soldiers who had been forcibly kept in Lyon. The Popular Commission literally declared it was offering an olive branch of peace, and tricolour flags could be seen flying across the city. Perhaps most importantly, as it became clear that neighbouring departments were submitting to the convention's authority, Lyon did the same, accepting that there was no practical way to reverse the purging of the Girondins. The Popular Commission declared that the convention appeared restored, with a sizable number of departmental and municipal officials having already publicly recognised the legitimacy of the events of 2 June, that being the purge of the Girondins. The hope was that a pathway to peace was now possible. But this left one small, somewhat gigantic problem. Remember, Lyon's municipal revolution, its overthrow of Charlet and the local Jacobins in late May, that had predated the purging of the Girondins. This all started over local politics and local antagonisms. Furthermore, it was fueled in no small part by the hostility towards Jacobin representatives on mission and their support for local allies. These issues remained alive and well. Lyon was now willing to recognize the convention's authority. Lyon was now willing to accept, albeit reluctantly, the proscription of the Girondin deputies. But it was not willing to back down from the municipal revolution which had overthrown the local Jacobins. The idea that the Jacobin municipality should be restored and that its opponents should be punished, well, that was ludicrous. From the perspective of Lyon's authorities, the events of late May had saved the city. It was the convention who had been misled in its reaction and response to a just and popular municipal revolution. Robespierre himself had defended the sacred right of insurrection when the government oppressed the people. Consequently, while the Popular Commission recognized the authority of the National Convention in late July, it attached terms and conditions. Lyon would remain in a state of resistance to oppression until the convention's ill-informed decrees were withdrawn. What this meant practically was a desire for the convention to recognize the legitimacy of Lyon's municipal revolution, to formally sanction the dissolution of the deposed municipality and grant amnesty for those who had helped to overthrow it. Without these concessions, many leading officials in the events since late May could well follow Charlet to the guillotine. Thus, Lyon was willing to come to terms with the National Convention. But terms there must be. Unconditional surrender was not on the menu. Unfortunately for Lyon, unconditional surrender was the only delicacy the convention was willing to offer. Still considered as counter-revolutionary intriguers, many Jacobins were suspicious of Lyon's acceptance of the constitution and its overtures for reconciliation. Some took exception to the conditions attached to the constitution's acceptance, while others just dismissed the whole thing as a deceitful ploy. In the Committee of Public Safety, the attitude was clear. On the 27th of July, Maximilien Robespierre had joined the committee, which now looked fundamentally different to the Danton-led body that we first met back in episode 57, The Institutions of Terror. We'll cover the committee's renewal in future episodes, but for now, what we need to know is that the body was more aggressive and more uncompromising compared to the moderate tendencies of Danton and his allies. Consequently, the Committee of Public Safety had limited appetite for Lyon's defiance of the sovereign nation. When the Interior Minister Gorat suggested that perhaps negotiated terms could be reached with Lyon, Robespierre shut him down. According to Gorat's account, Couthon was sympathetic to this suggestion, but Robespierre was clear. The solution to the Federalist crisis was to make a terrible example of the criminals who had outraged liberty and spilt the blood of patriots. So it would prove to be. No doubt hindering efforts for some sort of compromise was Jacobin ideology. From the perspective of the Jacobins, anti-Jacobinism was nothing more than counter-revolution. The idea that Lyon's authorities were simultaneously anti-Jacobin and sincerely Republican was nonsensical. Anti-Jacobinism was rooted in royalism, at least from the perspective of the Mountain. This obvious fact was proven by the appointment of a royalist aristocrat to command Lyon's forces. It was proven again by the persecution of patriotic and innocent Jacobins, such as Joseph Charlet. And, of course, it was proven definitively by the violent removal of the Jacobin municipality and the department's later efforts to aid the traitorous Girondin deputies and foment rebellion in the provinces. As such, the anti-Jacobin authorities of Lyon needed not terms of surrender, but rather termination. All that Paris was willing to offer was unconditional surrender. There could be no compromise with counter-revolution. Unsurprisingly, Lyon's answer was no. The siege that followed was scarring. Commencing in the second week of August, the conquest of Lyon became a protracted affair. Although the defending force numbered just a few thousand, the Republican army was itself undermanned, resulting in a strategy of encirclement and bombardment. The cannons fired both day and night. One local publication described the unceasing strikes as unparalleled in all of history. An exaggeration? Yes, but horrible nonetheless. The French were besieging their own city. And there lies the irony. As one observer noted, both sides would yell, "Long live the Republic," and both sides flew the tricolour flag. This was a struggle between citizens, a battle between brothers. As the siege wore on, the situation in the city became untenable. Starvation was imminent, and with the remaining Federalist revolts also crumbling, hope was as scarce as food. Thus, on the 9th of October, more than 4 months after the municipal revolution and the purge of the Girondins, the nation's second city finally gave in. The Convention's troops occupied Lyon. Even before the siege had commenced in August 1793, Robespierre had demanded a terrible example be made of Lyon. Months later, the Convention was in agreement. Seeing the city as corrupted by counter-revolution, the reprisals which followed were extensive. In order to investigate the infamous terror in Lyon, it is perhaps best to start with the stated goals of the national government. For this, we need not look any further than the Convention's notorious decree of 12 October. It was this decree which I quoted at the start of our exploration of Lyon's revolutionary history, and it was in this decree that the government declared that Lyon was no more. Proclaiming the destruction of the city, all buildings inhabited by the wealthy were to be demolished. Only those structures which had a public function or were owned by a patriot were to be left untouched. With all counter-revolutionaries to be punished without delay, the Convention was intent on eradicating every trace of royalism. In fact, even Lyon's tainted name was to be consigned to history. Henceforth, the small cluster of homes which remained would be called Ville-affranchie, Liberated City. Prior to the decree of 12 October, the harsh intentions of the Committee of Public Safety were already clear. Let them die then, and let the National Army, marching forward in a frightening manner, soon drag through the streets of this criminal city the blade that has threatened for only too long the heads of the guilty parties. Yet, despite all of this talk of annihilating Lyon and eliminating its counter-revolutionary inhabitants, we should ask the question: did all of this rhetoric match reality? Did the national government really demolish this den of aristocrats? And was a terrible example made of its defenders? Furthermore, of the actions undertaken, what can be considered excessive, given the contemporary norms of war and given the Republic's existential crisis? Lastly, where there is excess, who should we assign responsibility to? On whose hands do we find the blood of Lyon? Given the long shadow of the events we're about to discuss, these matters are contentious to say the least. To oversee Lyon's submission, the Committee of Public Safety again sent one of their own, this time Georges Couthon. In his mid-30s at the time of the Bastille's fall, Couthon had previously worked as a lawyer. A father capable of a joke at his own expense, he was generally considered to be likable, trustworthy, and interested in humanitarian pursuits. Elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1791, he was subsequently re-elected to the National Convention the following year. Bound to a wheelchair and at times carried from place to place due to his paralysis, Couthon's intellect and presence were nonetheless imposing. A staunch Jacobin, he was no moderate, but he also lacked the single-mindedness and zealotry that defined some of his peers. He can thus be at times a puzzle to historians, and his close association to Robespierre and the escalation of the Terror result in bitter divisions on how to perceive his character and service. Originally disappointed by the delays in subduing the city, Couthon was dispatched to speed up the siege. Hunger, however, was already sapping the defenders' strength, and Lyon succumbed shortly after the representatives' arrival. Couthon's account of the city's surrender shocked the Committee of Public Safety. The deputy had noted the warm welcome of Republican troops by Lyon's residents, and remarked that soldiers hugged and cried as they were reunited with their fellow brothers. Paris was displeased. In a stern response from the committee, Couthon and the other representatives on mission were admonished for fraternization with the enemy. Such indulgence was unacceptable. In a letter signed by Robespierre just days later, the committee warned, "You seemed to abandon yourself to a people who flatter the victors. You must unmask the traitors and strike them without pity. Carry out with inexorable severity the salutary decrees that are addressed to you." Reprimanded for the light-handed occupation of Lyon and for the escape of the royalist commander Précy, Couthon and his peers got to work. New institutions were established to identify and condemn those guilty of counter-revolution, and Couthon sought to implement some aspects of the Convention's October 12 decree. However, Couthon did so in a limited manner, often choosing to interpret the decree symbolically rather than literally. Take, for example, the demolition of Lyon. Carried to a public square, Couthon struck a wall 3 times with a hammer and vocally condemned the building to destruction. However, more substantial efforts were hardly forthcoming. In short, Couthon proceeded slowly. Whether it be the levelling of buildings or the beheading of traitors, Couthon's methods were deliberate, calculated, and most importantly, restrained. By no means a moderate, Couthon nevertheless sought to moderate the uncompromising rhetoric of Paris. Unable to do so indefinitely, within weeks of his arrival, Couthon was asking to be reassigned. Replacing Couthon was another member of the Committee of Public Safety, Collot d'Herbois. Having already served as a representative on mission elsewhere in France, Collot d'Herbois was known as a staunch Jacobin, a capable administrator, and a deputy ready to implement the terror in the provinces. Alongside Collot d'Herbois, another deputy was also assigned to Lyon, a gentleman named Fouché. To speak plainly, there was nothing gentle about him. The future Minister of Police of the Napoleonic era, Fouché was likewise an experienced representative on mission. He was also an experienced terrorist. To be clear, the term terrorist in the French Revolution does not match common associations with the term in the 21st century. Here, a terrorist simply means an advocate of repression and violence to further the government's revolutionary agenda, and it's actually from the French Revolution that we get the word terrorist. Historian Bill Edmonds argues that by appointing Collot d'Herbois and Fouché, the Committee of Public Safety gave a clear proof of its intention to increase the level of repression dealt to Lyon. After all, they were appointing 2 practiced terrorists. Likewise, historian Robert Palmer agrees, claiming that the committee had selected the 2 men from whom, in all of France, the people of Lyon could expect the least indulgence. In fact, Palmer asserts that while the committee did not know what these men would do, they did know that they were enthusiastic supporters of terror. Furthermore, the committee was instructing these enthusiasts to be severe in their methodology. If severity was indeed what they wanted, the Committee of Public Safety had chosen the right men for the job. To back up a bit, by November 1793, the Reign of Terror was underway. With the nation besieged from within and without, the government had embraced a series of exceptional measures designed to fight counter-revolution and reaction. Silencing political dissent through intimidation, arrests, and executions, the revolution's values and the republic's safety were to be secured through violence and repression. From the perspective of the Jacobins, this was entirely justifiable. Terror was the embodiment of speedy, severe, and inflexible justice, and that was what was required to save the virtuous republic. As committed Jacobins, both Collot d'Herbois and Fouché agreed, and they got to work. The transformation of Lyon was sweeping. Most notably, Collot d'Herbois oversaw the implementation of a regime that was essentially an experiment in the application of ultra-Jacobinism. More radical than Robespierre, the measures taken under Collot d'Herbois' leadership were extensive and adhered closely to the most extreme elements of the Sans-Culotte program. Through a range of new institutions, a variety of political, social, and economic policies were pursued. These included the redistribution of wealth to the poor from both the Catholic Church and the suspect rich. It also included the application of revolutionary taxes on the wealthy and the implementation of de-Christianization policies, such as the arrest of priests and the prohibition of religious services. Aid was provided to the poorest of citizens, and price maximums were vigorously enforced. with accompanying rhetoric vilifying the city's wealthy and the disproportionate persecution of rather well-off counter-revolutionaries, some historians see these measures as nothing short of a class war. Helping the deputies implement this radical program were not only local Jacobins, but a whole host of officials and soldiers from outside of Lyon. Even in his brief tenure, Couthon had become suspicious of his local allies, fearful that they could use the terror for personal vendettas, and mindful that the city's aristocratic corruption may have tainted the resident Jacobins. As such, the deputy had called for the creation of a colony of Jacobins to help regenerate the city, and in late October, the Parisian Jacobin Club dispatched patriots to assist the representatives on mission. Consequently, much of the institutions overseeing the terror in Lyon were staffed by outsiders. Committed Jacobins, yes, but not necessarily the same Jacobins who had been in Lyon's original Jacobin municipality. The importation of so many outsiders resulted in a tremendous amount of intra-Jacobin squabbles. Long-held regional rivalries played their part in magnifying tensions between the native Montagnards and the mountains agents from both Paris and further afield. On top of this, the Jacobins in the capital were starting to splinter into camps. Factions were emerging behind Robespierre, Danton, and Hébert, the latter inheriting much of Marat's influence amongst the ultra-radicals. Before long, Collot d'Herbois and Fouché were exacerbated by the endless feuds and quarrels. Thus, even in what was perhaps the most developed experiment in the application of ultra-Jacobinism, it was hardly all sunshine and rainbows amongst the victors. This was partially fueled by what the representatives on mission were unwilling to do. Lyon's Jacobins under Joseph Chalais had always been vocally antagonistic towards the rich, and while the authorities during the Terror maintained this radical rhetoric, there was at times a disconnect between words and reality. For example, a plan was formulated to establish 300 workshops to employ poorer patriots. With Lyon's silk industry in tatters, the need to create such employment programs aligned with both the war effort and Jacobin ideology. Theoretically, this would not only benefit the poor, but also create a republican core of commerce and industry. Ultimately, however, this plan came to nothing. Likewise, discussions were had to prevent businesses from growing too large by capping yearly revenues. This would help to diminish the power of the unpatriotic grand merchants and provide both greater independence and increased opportunities for regular artisans and workers. Once more, these proposals remained just that. As a result, disagreements over exactly what policies should and should not be implemented, and by whom, helped to further divide the Jacobin institutions now governing the city. Competing ideologies and policy priorities, mixed with social tensions, personal feuds, and historic provincial antagonisms, to create a rather convoluted mess. Critically, these divisions became substantial, and they would become important in the future when the blame game begins for the Terror's excesses. In fact, the feuds in Lyon play a non-insignificant role in the eventual downfall of Robespierre the following year. But make no mistake, while the Jacobins were attempting to implement a vast array of policies, and while the authorities were distracted by intra-party squabbles, terror remained a key objective. As such, by late November, Collot d'Herbois had become increasingly frustrated. Some of the courts initially established by Couthon were exceedingly slow, at least from Collot d'Herbois' perspective. The piecemeal execution of counter-revolutionaries was hardly propagating the terrible example Robespierre and the committee had demanded. As such, Collot d'Herbois formulated a plan. Bolstered by more volunteers from the so-called Revolutionary Army, Collot d'Herbois commenced an execution strategy which proceeded to horrify history. Seeking to dramatically speed up the delivery of justice, mass executions were to become the norm. Critically, Collot d'Herbois would retire the guillotine and bring in the cannon. Grapeshot would dispense with the revolution's enemies. On the 4th of December 1793, 60 men were chained together and marched out onto an open plain. Standing in front of multiple cannons, the prisoners were lined up near ditches. These shallow trenches would be their graves. When the cannons fired, the grapeshot produced the most grotesque scenes. Acting like gigantic shotguns, small metal balls shredded the chained prisoners. The lucky had a quick death. For the less fortunate, they had to wait until they were bludgeoned, stabbed, or shot. The killings continued the next day. Designed to terrorize the local population, the resulting scene was indeed horrific. More than 200 prisoners were brought out the following day, and once again they were chained together. Once again they were raked with grapeshot. The survivors cried in agony until mercy was finally delivered. More would be killed in the days to come. So packed were the shallow graves that the authorities had to take measures to avoid the outbreak of disease. Historian Julie Johnson notes that this brutal but ineffective method of killing quickly became soul-destroying for those who witnessed it and for those who had to enact the punishment. The authorities overseeing the executions promptly reversed course and discontinued the practice within days. The pace of firing squads and the guillotine quickened, but the horrific mass executions of chained prisoners by grapeshot, that had come to an end. For those interested, I've placed illustrations of the killings on Instagram, Discord, and in the email newsletter. Links are in the show notes. Yet, despite the evident horror of witnesses and even some executioners, not all were dismayed. While historian Michael Sydenham labels the killings as mass murder, some local Jacobins delighted in the justice which had been delivered. After all, from their perspective, this was an appropriate end for the traitors and intriguers who had overthrown the Jacobin municipality and led Lyon into rebellion and counter-revolution. One associate of Robespierre wrote to a friend in Paris, "Still the heads fall, heads every day. What delight you would have tasted if you had seen, day before yesterday, the national justice upon 209 scoundrels. What majesty! What imposing tone! It was all edifying. How many villains bit the dust in the arena! What a cement for the Republic!" Such enthusiasm for the killings, or at least an enthusiastic defense of them, can be seen from the representative on mission, Collot d'Herbois. He stated plainly, "By killing the scoundrels, we ensure the life of all generations of free men." The precise motivations that drove Collot d'Herbois to loudly embrace such drastic measures is a matter of extensive and consequential debate. Extensive because historians bitterly dispute if there were any personal motivations fueling this brutality. To explore these properly would involve a significant digression in an already lengthy episode, but luckily that is what we have bonus episodes for. Thus, In a full-length bonus episode exploring this and other contentious debates of Lyon's terror, we'll be examining the theories and counter-theories surrounding the deputy's personal motivations. From a disgruntled actor looking for a stage for revenge, to an ideological crusader committed to breaking the bourgeoisie, there's plenty to discuss. So, to hear historians share their views on the impetus for these brutal scenes, don't miss part 4 on our series on Lyon, a bonus episode available exclusively to members of the Grey History community. But the controversy of Lyon's mass killings surrounds not just Collot d'Herbois' motivations. In fact, they're debatably just a subset of a far more contentious and consequential dispute. And that dispute centers on responsibility. Who should we hold accountable for a terror which ultimately claimed just shy of 2,000 lives in a single city? Who is liable for the gruesome slaughter which historian Michael Sydenham considers to be nothing short of mass murder? This is no small matter for two critical reasons. Firstly, the issue of responsibility fundamentally defines one's interpretation of key revolutionary protagonists and events. Disputes over Lyon's terror go on to play a prominent role in future power struggles. In fact, Collot d'Herbois and Fouché will have an outsized role in overthrowing Robespierre in 1794, and they were in part motivated by fears that they were going to be held accountable for their violent excesses. Furthermore, not only does the matter of responsibility shape the way we view future intra-Jacobin struggles, but also it shapes the way we view Jacobinism itself. These killings, along with other excesses, underpin much of the bloody stigma attached to the French Revolution. At least for some scholars, the actions of Lyon's terrorists do tremendous damage to the revolutionary cause, as their violence discredits the revolution both at home and abroad. So, given the multiple reasons why the issue of responsibility is important, it's no surprise that it's also contentious. More traditional accounts of the revolution tend to depict Collot d'Herbois and Fouché as acting independently of the Committee of Public Safety. Exceeding their authority, these deputies enforced a brutal and bloody terror the likes of which Paris had never envisioned. One example of a scholar who agrees with this perspective is historian Robert Palmer. An expert on the committee, Palmer argues that while the committee believed in the merits of terror, they did not intend to have 2,000 people killed. Furthermore, they did not intend to have massacres theatrically staged, or for Lyon to be pillaged by unscrupulous intruders in the name of public duty. In short, responsibility lies with the representatives on mission. This rather orthodox perspective minimizes the role of the revolutionary government and emphasizes the accountability of the deputies in the field. Yet, this is grey history, and tremendous amounts of ink has been spilt on this issue of accountability. Other historians are not so sure. Instead of blaming Collot d'Herbois and Fouché in isolation, some argue that responsibility actually rests with the entire Committee of Public Safety, and to an extent, the National Convention as well. This interpretation of Lyon's terror fundamentally shifts our understanding of events, as it transfers the bloodshed of Lyon onto the hands of many in the revolutionary government, rather than just a few officials in the field. Furthermore, historian Paul Mansfield actually goes further, placing great emphasis on Robespierre's personal responsibility in particular. Now, given that the fallout of Lyon's terror plays a sizable part in the machinations that topple Robespierre, and given that it plays a noteworthy role in tarnishing the revolutionary project, these perspectives fundamentally challenge some of the key narratives surrounding Robespierre, the Committee of Public Safety, and the Jacobin Terror. They also test other debates, such as the centrality of ideology in explaining the Terror's developments. Thus, in the full-length bonus episode exploring multiple contentious debates of Lyon's Terror, we'll also be exploring these historical perspectives. More specifically, we'll be unpacking historian Paul Mansfield's arguments that the Committee of Public Safety, the Convention, and Robespierre personally all bear much greater responsibility for the bloodshed than many orthodox retellings suggest. Furthermore, we'll also be unpacking some arguments against this interpretation and using comparisons to the terror in Normandy after its failed Federalist revolts to explore these perspectives. So, if you'd like to listen to part 4 on Lyon's Federalist revolts, examining a range of controversial debates surrounding Lyon's terror, please support the show and join the Grey History community. I need your support to keep this revolution going, so help produce history that isn't black and white and enjoy tons of members-only benefits in the process. Please support Grey History today. By the time the terror ended in Lyon, the city had indeed become a terrible example. Perhaps as many as 2,000 people had been killed, with more than double that imprisoned for various lengths of time. As such, more than 10% of the terror's official deaths came from the city. Only Paris and the Vendée were deadlier. Together with the mass drownings at Nantes and the infamous trials in Paris, the slaughter in Lyon, particularly those conducted by mass killings, permanently tainted the revolutionary project. As historian Bill Edmonds notes, the public slaughter played no small part in attaching the stigma of brutality to both the revolution and the Jacobins. Enchaining prisoners before ditches and shredding them with grape shot, the horrific scenes contributed to turning European opinion against the revolution. For the monarchies of Europe, such displays were a propagandist's delight, and the killings isolated foreigners who could be linked with the Jacobin cause. Historian Peter Kropotkin, coming from a completely different school of historical thought than Edmonds, agrees. Usually one to find ways to justify bloodletting and popular violence, the anarcho-communists' views on Lyon's terror are notable. From Kropotkin's perspective, the events did immense harm to the revolutionary project. Given that harm, and given the death of almost 2,000 people, it is worth ending this episode on a question. Was it justified? Was it worth it? Was the terrible example made of the Republic's second city a mistake or a necessity? Was this justice or barbarity? For some, the answer is unambiguous. Marxist historian Albert Sabul wholeheartedly defends the actions of the terrorists. For him, the severity of the response was nothing short of appropriate. It was proportionate, to use his own words, to the danger which the city's rebellion had posed. Yet, despite this unequivocal defence, even scholars holding similar worldviews can come to an entirely different conclusion. After all, historian Peter Kropotkin was clear in his conviction that the events in Lyon caused the revolution immense harm. And here lies a key point in this debate. Given the controversial role these events have in the eventual downfall of leading Jacobins, including Robespierre, even historians who are usually sympathetic to the Mountain and to the Terror can find reasons for dismay. In particular, those who sympathise with Robespierre and thus dislike the men who overthrow him often share the former's criticisms. As historian Marisa Linton notes, Robespierre eventually came to the conclusion that Collot d'Herbois, Fouché, and others were far from men of virtue. Instead, he considered them corrupt and hypocritical, men who had sullied the terror with their atrocities in Lyon. Robespierre's perspectives can be seen influencing the work of scholars who generally defend him, allowing them to justify the wider terror while simultaneously condemning the excesses in the Republic's second city. For example, historian Peter McPhee characterizes the events of Lyon as an unchecked and horrific repression. However, despite questioning the appropriateness of these specific measures, he nonetheless stresses the merits and justifications for the terror more broadly. In addition to these perspectives, you of course find conservative and revisionist historians who see Lyon as just one scene in a much larger tragedy. Especially for those who view the terror with disdain, the events in Lyon offer a potent example of unjustifiable and potentially counterproductive excess. Historian Bill Edmonds states plainly that it is difficult to see how the level of violence used in Lyon could have been needed as a deterrent. Instead, he proposes that Lyon's terror was the product of contempt, paranoia, and mistrust, the result being an extreme repression which cannot be justified using the same rationale sometimes used to justify the broader terror. Whatever the case may be, these debates exemplify the history of Lyon. The only thing more plentiful than silk is contention. In these last 3 episodes, I've sought to explore a history defined by contradictions. Although often portrayed as simply a royalist bastion, the truth is far more complex. At times, Lyon led Paris. At times, it lagged it. And for years, it could mirror the dynamics of the capital before suddenly turning them on their head. From its unique network of neighborhood clubs to its unusual social and economic situations, the history of revolutionary Lyon is fundamentally different to that of revolutionary Paris. It's for this reason that we have taken the time to explore this great city as we seek to understand the French Revolution in wider France. Paris and the provinces were different. Yet, the story and horrors of the Republic's second city is not the only other history of note. For to the south of Lyon, other rebellions also shaped the revolutionary era, as well as what was to come. In the commotion of mid-1793, the great Mediterranean ports of Marseille and Toulon likewise rose in rebellion, and they too have a story to tell. A story that will eventually see the Republic transformed into the Empire. Thank you for listening to episode 66, Lyon, Liberated City. The next episode will be a bonus episode available exclusively to members of the Grey History community. Titled Lyon, the Blame Game, we'll be exploring several controversies of Lyon's terror. Was Collot d'Herbois motivated by revenge? Did Robespierre defend the gruesome killings? Should the government in Paris share moral responsibility for the bloodshed? And can these events be described as an example of class war? This is just some of the grey history that community members will be diving into. So don't miss out on this great bonus episode for members of the Grey History community. Or, for that matter, the half a dozen other bonus episodes and dozens of episode extras. With ad-free listening, regular bonus content, and a members-only chat room on Discord, come join the party and help support one of your favourite independent podcasts. There's links in the show notes and on the website. One final welcome to the newest members of the Grey History community, and a special shout out again to the extraordinarily generous heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Christy, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, and Howard. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Stay safe and have a great day.